everybody. Next, we have a panel on tracking and treating depression with digital health tools from UCLA's Depression Grand Challenge. If my panelists could turn on their microphones and videos, please. I will turn the microphone over to Joel Kehle, Business Development Officer for TDG. Thank you so much.
Dina, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted to thank the audience for joining me today in this discussion about tracking and treating depression using digital health tools for UCLA's Depression Grand Challenge. For those of you who aren't familiar, UCLA's Depression Grand Challenge is a multifaceted effort to cut the burden of depression in half by 2050 and eliminate it by the end of the century. This is all the more challenging because depression, even though it is the most common cause of disability worldwide, is still not really understood. So I'm looking forward today to talking to Professor Michelle Craske and Professor Jonathan Flint, who are co-founders of the UCLA Depression Grand Challenge. They are both leaders in the fields of psychiatry and biobehavioral science. And I'm very interested in hearing their thoughts and their update on what they've been doing to track and treat depression. So Michelle and Jonathan, thank you both for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So Michelle, I wanted to start by asking you what you've been up to. Last year's MedTech conference, I had a great talk with a panelist about the methods you had discovered to use virtual reality to treat a symptom of depression known as anhedonia. And I understand you've been working on some new tools as part of the Depression Grand Challenge to treat depression, and I was hoping that you could share with us what you've been working on.
Certainly, certainly. Yes, well, as you alluded to, we're very focused on depression and anxiety and related conditions because there is an enormous need. Rates are high, rates are increasing. We do have evidence-based treatments, and yet less than half of individuals who are in need receive any kind of treatment. So there is an enormous mental health gap. And that gap will simply never be filled by traditional clinical models of care. So the Depression Grand Challenge has developed a new system for delivery of care called STAND, which represents screening and treatment for anxiety and depression. And it is a scalable model of care because it leverages technology. And I'll say the previous mention you made of anhedonia is sort of a component within this broader umbrella of the STAND model of care. And so I thought what I could do is just briefly outline what that model of care is. It'll take me a few minutes and then talk about where we're implementing it. So the model of care, okay, good. So the model of care begins with an online adaptive testing tool that enables us to get immediate measures of symptoms of depression, anxiety, suicidality, mania, that individuals can complete by cell phone or by computer, wherever they want, at any time they want, and with immediate feedback to indicate their current or presenting level of symptomatic need. From that, we, in the STAND system of care, we then route individuals to one of three levels of care. The lowest level of care is for those who are none to mild in terms of symptomatology, and they receive an online cognitive behavioral therapy program that's designed specifically to prevent the onset of depression and anxiety. For those who present with mild to moderate depression or up to severe anxiety, we provide a suite of evidence-based online cognitive behavioral therapy programs that we have actually developed at UCLA, which are delivered with the support of trained and certified coaches who provide coaching by video chat. Those who are severely depressed are routed to clinicians. So in this model, the clinicians, which is the most costly and limited resource, are reserved for those individuals who have the greatest symptomatic need. Now, the system of care does more than that. It has a wraparound. We continuously track the progress of people once they enter into these different levels of care using that online adaptive testing tool. And that tracking enables us to do two things. First of all, it enables us to adapt the level of care with high levels of efficiency. So if somebody is showing a worsening of symptom status, we can immediately route them up to a higher level of care to prevent full relapse. If they've showed improvement from the highest level of care, we can route them down to the lower level of care. Again, a cost-efficient mechanism, but one that's highly important for maintaining treatment gain. So that adapting level of care is critical. And then the second thing that the continuous tracking enables us to do is to monitor suicide risk, so that whenever an individual endorses suicidality, we have an automated program that alerts a 24/7 crisis team who can reach out and offer guidance and help in a very proactive manner. And all of these decisions currently are based on symptom reporting, so patient-reported outcomes. Where we're heading is to complement the patient-reported outcomes with continuously tracked behavioral indicators that I think Jonathan will talk more about. Reliable indicators, indicators that mean something, that can then inform clinical decision-making and improve the precision, sensitivity, and efficiency of our entire system of care.
That is marvelous. I have so many questions. I guess my first question is, you had touched upon the fact that it is so difficult to reach all of the people that need care with current models. Do you have a sense of what the expansion is with this new model? You know, if you could have treated one person before in the United States, now you can treat 2 people, now you can treat 10 people. I'm curious, just seems like such a great tool. I'm curious how many more people will benefit from this.
Yes, I don't have the exact numbers, but the scope is very large. We built this model for large population-based studies and programs because the digital mental health component, which really is targeting that middle range of depression and anxiety severity, which is the largest group in the population. So if you look at the population, around 10% on average is severely depressed at any given time, and 25 to 35% are in that mild to moderate category. All typically go to clinicians for support. So we would be able to offset that burden on clinicians by targeting this large middle group of individuals with the digital mental health. The other thing I'll say is many people have barriers to coming into clinician care, whether it's cost, time, effort, scheduling, transportation, or stigma. And the digital mental health program with the coach support just overcomes many of those barriers.
Yeah, I would see, for all the reasons that you touched on, you know, anything that makes it easier for someone to get the care they need. You know, maybe they don't have the time to get somewhere in the middle of the day. This just seems like a fantastic opportunity. The other question that popped into my mind, you had mentioned that the suite of interventions that you have are evidence-based. And in my mind, I immediately went to regulators. And so where is UCLA with, or even at the stage yet where you're engaging regulators where they will acknowledge, you know, where this is approved, and so then that's the first step to getting these kind of treatment modalities supported by insurance? Right.
Yes. So there are 2 ways of doing that. There are programs now from the digital mental health arena that have achieved that FDA approval, and we are not. At UCLA, our program is not at that level yet just because we haven't pursued it, not because we don't have the evidence base. Everything we do is evidence-based. We've just put it into a unified platform. But it looks like FDA regulations are now allowing these kind of programs for reimbursement, especially when combined with coaching by licensed professionals who are paraprofessionals in the sense that they're not expert clinicians, but nonetheless they are providers who are either have their own license or under the licensure of another person. So reimbursement is, the way we've been looking at it, and as we implement in the healthcare system, will be part of what we do.
Excellent, excellent. And I should say for the audience, if I didn't say this at the beginning, that if you have any questions for myself or Michelle or Jonathan, please type them into the chat, and then as we're going along in our conversation, we will do our best to answer your questions. And Dina, I wanted to see, has anyone come up with a question as of yet?
Yes, one question about measuring efficacy with these tools versus more traditional tools.
So we currently measure efficacy based on the using the online adaptive testing, which is a symptom report measure. So it's patient-reported outcomes, which is valuable, and particularly in the way we currently use it, because we observe weekly the sort of changes in symptom status. Where we're heading, though, is to complement this measurement-based system with indicators of daily functioning. And I think Jonathan's going to talk more about those kind of indicators in a moment, because we really see the coming together of all of the development work in the apps and the wearable sensors that can follow a person's daily life to become critical measures for how do you select treatment, how do you adapt treatment, how do you measure treatment outcome.
Thank you.
Great, Jonathan. I think that's a nice segue. I'm hearing two different components which I'd like to learn more about. And one is the adaptive testing. And if you can unpack that for us, what is the testing and why is it adaptive? And then the second thing, which Michelle is hinting at, and that's that you can unlock the power of a cell phone or other devices to gather additional information about a patient to understand something about their mental health. So I'm curious about both those areas.
Sure, I'll see what I can do to help you. So for the first one, I think the best way to think about this is what I would do if I'm meeting you as your clinician, and I would typically be asking you a lot of questions to elicit a set of symptoms to meet diagnostic criteria. And the alternative at the moment has been to give a questionnaire, just a set of maybe 10 or 20 questions, and you'll tick yes and no. And we find that method, although it's easy and cheap, is not very accurate. So an alternative to both of these is to do the following. We have, let's say, 1,000 questions. I can ask you how you feel in many different ways. I don't always ask it exactly the same. And I do that partly because when I'm interacting with you, I'll use a choice of words which I think is appropriate to you. So we can sort of mimic that by taking, let's say, 1,000 questions and giving those to hundreds of people, and then taking those responses and seeing how the questions correlate. So that if I ask you one question as a random member of the group I looked at, I would have a pretty good idea of how you'd answer a set of other questions. And with that information, I can then choose, and this will be dependent on the first question I give you, the most appropriate question to give you next. So it's adaptive in the sense that it's adapting to how you answer the first question I give you. And I can train this system to deliver a very accurate diagnosis because I'll be querying the same domains that I would if we're trying to make a diagnosis of depression as when I was sitting down and talking to you about your sleep, your appetite, your mood. So the adaptive tool that we use is one that Robert Gibbons in Chicago has produced, but the technology is well known. It's based on this method called item response theory, which takes the information you get from a single item and tries to maximize that by choosing others. And Robert's made some nice alterations to that approach so that you can use it in this diagnostic way. So what you end up with would be maybe half a dozen questions, each of which would be specific for you, and the accuracy of that would be far superior to what we would get from a questionnaire. And it has two big advantages as far as we're concerned. One is that it's really quick. I mean, you can get through this in a few moments. And the second, which follows from that, it's scalable. So Michelle mentioned, and you've already raised this, about our ability to reach not tens, not hundreds, but I'm afraid, we have this ambition to cure depression everywhere. So we have global aspirations for this. So anything that we can scale would be really helpful for us. So that's why we have an adaptive test. That's what it's for. And your second question was around the digital phenotyping, which Michelle also mentioned. So ideally, what we'd like to do is to be able to monitor people's moods as much as possible. And just giving people questionnaires or giving them the adaptive testing isn't going to be ideal, because they have to devote time to that. It's going to get boring. Their interest in us might lapse. And particularly if their mood drops, they're even less likely to want us to talk to anybody, because as one of the features of depression is a sort of basic withdrawal and sort of social isolation. So we've been thinking hard about how can we collect observable, robust information without people having to interact. And the methods that we're using at the moment are interrogating activity on people's phones. So we take data from their phone usage. We take data from the GPS telling us where they are. We take even simple things like phone on-off time, which not accurately, but to some extent correlates with sleep time. So particularly amongst the student population, the first thing they do in the morning is turn the phone on, and the last thing they do is turn it off. So that gives you a rough indication of what their sleep patterns are like. And we've been surprised how even those relatively crude measures do approximate to some biological phenomenon. You can see from the plots we get out when people have an episode of early morning awakening, which is very classic of depression. So our question then becomes, which of those measures that we're collecting off the phone is most predictive of mood? And we've been running studies to try and isolate what those should be, and we've made some progress around doing that. So that really is the sort of core elements of our digital phenotyping system.
Joel, there was a question about how long after treatment is there tracking?
Well, we try to do this all the time. Mm-hmm. It's continuous. Right? So, at the moment, go ahead, Michelle.
No, go ahead.
At the moment, as you know, we can't cure depression, so we can symptomatic relief, we can make people better, but we work under the assumption that the disorder is going to recur. And therefore, we would like to keep people involved as much as possible. Even if the tracking tells us they're fine, that's reassuring, but we suspect that they may need help in the future.
Yeah, and I was just going to add on to that in our current programs, we follow people for at least a year, but ideally, in our minds, given the changing needs over the course of developmental periods or even longer than that, this could be a way of like a wellness program that sort of continuously checks, where am I at? What do I need right now? Okay, I'm in more of a crisis mode. Behavior is going downhill. Sleep is messed up. My voice tone is changing. I need to do something right now. And it's also a way of really, in clinical samples, really, identifying future status. So it's not just ongoing status, but what pattern of behavior now is predictive of something in the future, which would say, let's intervene in order to prevent that from happening. So we think of this as long-term intervention. Even though a given treatment may be short, the tracking would continue to support further booster sessions or treatments as needed.
Great, thank you. I guess either one of you could, or both of you could tackle this next question, and that's when is this going to be available in different phases? I guess is this currently available at UCLA to students and other people that are helping you gather data for research, or I guess what is the rollout plan?
So Jonathan, I'll start with the treatment side and then, So the treatment side of things, which is currently based fairly much on patient report, using the adaptive testing tool, nonetheless, has been rolled out at UCLA already. So we were from fall 2017 to December 2019 operating on the UCLA campus to manage the exceptionally high need. That then shut down, or went on hiatus, I should say, during COVID-19. We're now rolling out in local community colleges because of high levels of need and limited resources in those settings. That's now operational. And we are about to roll out in the UCLA health system.
And in terms of the digital phenotyping, so we have been lucky enough to start working with Apple, who are very keen on using their technology to identify the same features that we've been discussing. We've started a pilot with them, and we'll hope, really starting from about now for the next year, to generate the data that would allow us to have a much more efficient way of monitoring people 24 hours a day, which would mean if things work well, we might have something usable within about a year from now, I would hope. And maybe the other thing to talk about briefly, Joel, as you maybe save you asking the question, is our global aspirations. I mean, I came to TGG with this question some time ago, is that we wanted to try and roll this out in different countries. And I, for some years, have been working in East Asia. We run a large program on the causes of depression in China. And we wanted to know whether the methodology that Michelle has developed for the UCLA student population would be something that would work in other countries. And this turns out to be challenging, not only because of the regulatory issues, but simple things like how do we collect the information we need to set up the tools, and then most importantly, trying to integrate those detection tools with the treatment, and making sure that the clinicians can use that information in a way that's useful. So there's a whole set of integration issues around health systems, needs of patients in different settings, which we're still negotiating. It's relatively easy for us to say we have a system that works with the UCLA population. Turns out to be pretty hard to transport that into different cultures. But we are gradually making progress. We've been working on this now for a couple of years, and we're just beginning to collect the first pieces of data, which I'm sure will show us the way ahead. And
oops, no, I'm not on mute. In terms of difficulties, if there is language difficulties, cultural difficulties, infrastructure, regulatory, where, if you would, think of all of the different challenges for making this a global solution, where is the next or the most difficult area that you're focusing on?
My guess is it's going to depend which country you're dealing with. I mean, let me give you one example. When I first suggested deploying this in a large university in Shanghai, there was initially some excitement. They said, yes, we'd like to provide something to help our students. They could see the success in UCLA. And then as we went through the details of this, and I explained what we were going to be asking, there was a recoil, because one of the things that's really critical, and one of the reasons we do this, is because we ask about suicide risk. And as soon as I mentioned that word to my Chinese host, it was like a sort of, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. He said, "You can't mention that." I said, "What do you mean? I'm sure that would happen." They said, "Well, the only person who knows about suicide in our university, this is a university of about 40,000 students, the only person who knows is the equivalent of the chancellor. This information is kept really, really private. We can't go about asking this." So faced with that sort of problem, how do you then convince people that it's essential to ask these questions, and that you won't, in so doing, disrupt both the culture and the expectations of the students and of the staff? That's really hard. Whereas in other places, I know that won't be an issue. So I think it's going to be a question of us having to try each location and be very sensitive to these difficulties, because it's hard otherwise.
And I'll give one other example, because we are doing a rollout of a smaller version in South Africa, and there the issue is access to the internet.
which is not a problem in China.
Very interesting. Completely. One is a technical and or an economic issue, and the other is a cultural issue. So it does really depend on the environment you're trying to reach, the market, if you will, you're trying to reach. So I have another question, and I'll note that your audience is stakeholders that are invested in digital health, and whether they're investors or companies or fellow researchers. And so on your wish list of new features or tools or technologies which would help you all either do something faster or better, is there anything out there that you wish existed or you wanted to know about that could accelerate your work?
Well, it would certainly be helpful to have more people involved in thinking about this problem and how we might get it deployed in different situations. I've been working in Taiwan, and there we contacted an entrepreneur who set up a business which does booking reservations in local restaurants. So he has software engineering skills. He happened to be a UCLA alumnus and heard us give a talk, and he approached me afterwards and has offered a lot of his time and energy in helping us deploy a system for monitoring the Taiwanese population. So we're always open to people coming forward and providing those sorts of things, because it really helps us deal with the local issues that we were discussing a moment ago.
I think that's a wonderful ask, and certainly this is the right audience. So if someone in the audience is interested in helping this get deployed somewhere across the globe, please find me or one of the professors, and we'll figure it out. Michelle, did you have any thing that you wanted to add to that?
I think that's the most critical issue. The other thing I was thinking is just the methodology for developing the predictive algorithms that will enable us to personalize the treatments that are based on the compilation of behavioral data, patient report data, hopefully some more biologically driven data and cognitively driven data. We have a lot of expertise at UCLA that will help with that, but it never hurts to get somebody else's perspective on the best models for combining and developing predictive models.
Yeah, maybe I should just comment on that. It's a really important point. When we started doing this, I was naively thought that it's a question of collecting the data longitudinally on a group of people and then maybe dividing them based on the information we got from their adaptive tools testing, to say, here's a group of people we think have depression, here's a group of people who don't, and then try and identify the digital phenotyping features, things we're getting off their phone, that separated those two. And we did that, and there's some differentiation, but really not very much. And we struggled for this for quite a while to think, what is the better way of doing it? And it was only then that it struck us that actually we were asking the wrong question, because we're not wanting a tool that differentiates one group of people with depression from another. What we want is a tool that differentiates you when you're well from you when you're depressed. And that's requiring a different way of analyzing the data and a different set of features that might be important. So what differentiates a group is not necessarily the same thing as differentiating an individual. So we've now thought about this much more as a set of hidden features, things which are pointing to whether you might become depressed or not, and trying to interrogate our longitudinal data. So we now think of this as, say, it's taking a few months of training data, because we don't make any assumptions about what works for you. And once we've trained our algorithm, we then start to run some tests. So that's a fairly now typical artificial intelligence problem, pattern recognition, and trying to use that to make predictions. But this is by no means a solved problem. And I think having more people think about this and move into this area would be really helpful to us. It's difficult, and we haven't solved this by any extent. One thing that's also worth pointing out is that we're getting hints, and if this does prove to be true, I think it would be really powerful. We're getting hints that we can make predictions about your mood in the future. So at the moment, we're trying to ask, what are you like now? So that I can alert your doctor or alert you, and if things are going wrong. But if we could say, we think that tomorrow things are going to get really bad for you, so you need to do A, B, and C, that's going to be a much better way to stop things going wrong. So prediction becomes, I think, a key element to this. And there are some clues that we would be able to do this.
Yeah, and that's critical to the overall STAND model of care, being able to predict future status so that we can change plans now for a given individual to prevent something that could be worsening.
Excellent. That's a very exciting goal, and we certainly have a number of talented researchers in the deep learning community. So hopefully we'll be hearing from someone from this talk, and they will be able to contribute to solving this problem. I wanted to turn to Dina now. I think she's been looking at audience questions to see if anyone in the audience wanted to ask you something.
Yes, we've actually gotten a couple of logistical questions, which I think are important in terms of rollout. So the first one is, are your measures and treatments, or will they be integrated into electronic health record systems?
Eventually, they will be. So that is the goal. Getting there is one of the barriers.
Thank you. And the other is, are you having any difficulty in obtaining consent for collecting data using the phone or phone use data?
You know, we did a pilot study of the phone app on about 400 students at UCLA, and had very little difficulty getting consent. I think one participant.
But that may be because students are used to sharing their data and they're not quite so internet phobic as other parts of the population. So that will again, it comes back to the issue that Joel raised about what are going to be the bottlenecks and to rolling this out, and it'll vary a lot, even within one place, different age groups and so on. It's going to be hard to deal with this.
Very interesting. Those were the two current audience questions, Joel.
Maybe I could just raise one other thing which I think is important to think about here, which is the type of data that we're collecting. So typically, psychiatrists and psychologists have worked with interrogation, asking you questions, and it comes back as a set of yes or no answers. Maybe it might be quantitative, but we haven't had tools which generate large amounts of quantitative data in the way that we are now from phones. And the very high dimensional amount of information we're collecting poses its own set of unique challenges. So there are some purely technical issues about what sort of flow of information do you get off the phone? One of the things that rather surprised me when we were looking at the data coming from the student population, but we don't quite know why this happened, but some of the phones were reporting back to us every 5 seconds. So that's going to be, the batteries is going to die within a couple of hours. So there's issues around there. And tracing this back, it was clear it depended on the phone type and the operating system that they were using. So Android was all over the place, whereas iOS, as you can imagine, is much more regulated, and it was marching through every 3 hours. It might send us a little snippet of information, but it was sort of Wild West for some of these operating systems and some of these phones. So we don't quite know what's controlling that. But it did raise a more fundamental question with us as to what is the right data stream, how much do we need, at what sort of level, and how do you then analyze it in a way that becomes compatible with simple things like battery life and phone usage. And those technical issues I have absolutely no idea with, and the more that, again, that we'd interact with people who have those sorts of skills, it would work. So we do have engineers on our team, but as I was saying about the analysis, these are very much, I think, still open questions where people's involvement would be useful. And one additional point to make about this is that one of the things we've been taking off the phones, not in this project, but in another that we've been doing, is voice recordings, which is a classic multidimensional measure. From about a minute or a couple of minutes of recordings, we take something like 700 features. Some of these are derived measures, some are raw. And from those coefficients, we try and construct predictors, again, trying to tell us what people's mood might be. And this is, if it works, is a very powerful way, because we can be processing data in real time in phone calls and in clinics to make predictions about what people's moods are and whether they're going to need some sort of intervention. And it was striking that the types of questions we were using were very simple demographic. Where do you live? What is your father's job? What have you been doing in your work recently? Rather than, as you might think, questions which might be emotionally loaded along the lines of, please tell us about the most serious depressive episode you've had. So it would be worth reaching out to the rest of the community and ask them to think about these things, about both the way the data are collected as a technological problem and a data analysis problem. As I said, I just want to emphasize again, these are not solved problems.
Yeah, now that you're raising... No, please, Dina, go ahead.
The question is there a difference between depression and anxiety treatment using digital tools?
That's a very interesting question. Depression and anxiety, as you may guess, have a lot in common. They also have some unique features to them. And we tend to think of these conditions as a bunch of dimensions that come together and cross over with each other or are more unique. So from a behavioral therapy perspective, there are different programs that target those different dimensions. So for example, depression highly loads onto a dimension of anhedonia. Anhedonia is very much connected with deficits in reward processing and reward sensitivity. And so the behavioral treatments focused on that, and the pharmacological treatments, are very much focused on how do you activate that reward neurocircuitry, how do you activate the reward system. Anxiety, much more focused on fear responding and perceived threat, so elevated threat reactivity. So there, the behavioral treatments are much more focused on how do you dampen the threat response as opposed to increase the reward response. So we have different behavioral strategies, but with the sort of behavioral tracking from apps and wearables, we think we can do an even better job at fitting those different treatments to the different profiles that present. So hopefully I answered that question. There are differences and similarities is the answer.
Dina, was there another audience question?
There was not, and we have just a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if we have time for another question or not, even though I have about 100 of them. I can't help myself. It's such a fascinating topic. Instead of my asking you questions, Michelle or Jonathan, do you have any final points you'd like to share about the STAND project?
I think I'd like to just mention that something I touched on briefly before. We're now at the point of rolling this whole program out at a local community college, East Los Angeles College, which is a large college with 36,000 students at one of their sites, of whom large proportions have depression and anxiety. They have very few resources available to them, and they're dealing with enormous stresses in terms of housing security and financial security. So access to mental health care is very, very strapped. And our goal here is to test this out at ELAC so that it can become a vision statewide for the community colleges around California, which cover an enormous number of students, over 20 million students together. And so this, if people are interested in learning more about the ways in which we're navigating this application into a different setting, which takes a lot of integration of different resources, but we've managed it, it's possible, and we think could actually have quite a massive impact on people's lives. And so anybody who's interested in that should reach out to us.
I'd just like to emphasize the same, please contact us. This is a problem of global proportions. Depression is the single largest cause of disability anywhere in the world. We're not treating it well, and we need your help.
Well, thank you both for sharing what you're doing and getting the word out. This is the right audience to be making that ask of, and I'm hopeful that you'll get some very good responses back. So thank you very much for your time and all of this information.
Well, thank you for inviting us to take part.
Thank you.
And I'd like to add my thanks as well, and a final comment from one of the audience members, which was, this is incredible, and I absolutely agree. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.